Cutting material is a common operation in the blacksmith shop. You need to cut materials hot at the anvil, such as using a hardie tool. Sometimes you need to cut material before you can come to the anvil. Sometimes you're cutting material at the bench or in the vise. Lots of different situations where you're going to have to cut something. And we've talked about cutting in a lot of different forms in videos throughout the series. But we've never really just looked at what are the options for cutting tools in the blacksmith shop. So today I thought we would look at just some of those tools that are common, and maybe some I have that are not so common, and talk about the pros and cons of them, and just kind of show you what's available. And then at the end I'll make my recommendation on what I think is the absolute minimum that you should have in your shop. Of course, the cutoff hardie is the classic tool we think of for cutting material hot. It has a square shank that fits in the square hardie hole of the anvil. It allows you to hold the material in one hand, a hammer in the other hand. Very convenient, very efficient. But not everybody has a hardie, or even has an anvil with a hardie hole if you're using some sort of a makeshift anvil. In that case, just a handheld hot chisel that's way easier to make is almost as effective as a hardie. The handheld chisel will do things that aren't easy with a hardie, like splitting a bar to make a fork or something. It's better not to cut all the way through. Taking the bar and breaking the piece, so that last little bit of the piece off, is a little bit better practice. You can also have hot chisels that are handled like a hammer, and that gets your hand away from the heat. And these are really good if you're working with a striker or under a treadle hammer, and there are special versions of this for under the power hammer. And we'll take a look at some of that too. But these are all just chisels, and they can be hot chisels. They can even be cold chisels for cutting material cold at the anvil. For use under the power hammer, we frequently use a very short chisel, so it's not as likely to tip under the heavy blows of the power hammer. It's a little bit more controllable. And again, you don't want to cut all the way through into your bottom die of the hammer, so you need a cutting plate, or you cut part way through, turn it over, and then use a square-edged snapper. And that's more specific to a power hammer, and when we talk more about power hammer tooling, we will discuss this in more detail. Now, we don't always want to cut material hot. There are lots of reasons to prepare your stock and have it cut to length before you get to the anvil. And using cold chisels and cold cut hardies can be a little bit more work and isn't always desirable. In fact, very few people cold cut material at the anvil these days. It's not a common thing at all. For that, we have a tool that is really quite effective, very affordable, doesn't require any electricity. The basic hacksaw is extremely useful. Buying a good quality, rigid hacksaw frame that doesn't bow and flex and have trouble holding the blade makes your life way easier, as does buying top quality blades. You're just wasting time and money buying cheap blades, spending the extra money. The blades will last longer, they cut faster, they cut straighter because they are simply better blades. A hacksaw is really useful. You'll use it for a lot of things. And it just takes practice. When you start, you won't cut a straight line, and the only way to get better is to use it and practice with it. But if you don't want to do it manually, and a hacksaw will do a whole lot more than a lot of the other options, but we can do simple cutting at the vise with a power tool. We've talked about angle grinders in the past, and you've seen me use an angle grinder on several videos, and you can get these that are battery operated, so you don't need to plug them into the wall. And if you've got a non-electric shop, you can charge the batteries in the house and bring them to the shop. You'll want to wear hearing protection for this because it's noisy, and you probably ought to wear respiratory protection because they also throw out a lot of dust. And always eye protection with the power tools. Using an abrasive blade in an angle grinder may be loud, it's noisy, it's dusty, it has some issues, but it will cut hardened steel. So if you've got salvage material like a coil spring or a leaf spring you need to cut, that will cut it, whereas your hacksaw will not. It'll wear out a hacksaw blade long before you make any progress. So that's an advantage of abrasive blades, whether it's the angle grinder or an actual chop saw. They will do the hardened material. So that's a plus in favor of the angle grinder. Now, we've seen this little bandsaw in quite a few videos. There's a video on how I made the stand for the porta-band. It's just a portable bandsaw. It's meant to be handheld, and it can be removed from this stand easily and still used as a handheld bandsaw. But I use it this way 95% of the time. It's a nice little benchtop saw, very versatile, very handy. And it'll even cut some gentle curves, which is nice to have that ability sometimes. Again, it won't cut hardened steel, so it's limited. And it has a problem that if you're doing a long cut to split something, it hits the back of the saw. So someday I would like to find an actual benchtop, high-quality bandsaw that is a replacement for this, but has the blade off to the side more like a regular bandsaw instead of the way the porta-band is set up. I haven't seen one yet. The ones you find that are that size are pretty cheap, but I'm sure somewhere out there is a high-quality one. While we're talking about bandsaws, we can look at this big thing. Now, this is perhaps the fantasy bandsaw in most blacksmith shops. Most people want one, but most people never get one because buying them new is outrageously expensive. You could buy a really nice self-contained power hammer brand new for what it costs to buy a Marvel number 8 bandsaw brand new. But there's lots of old ones out there, and they're usually about $3,000 or $4,000. This one I managed to get on eBay for $500 because it didn't run and was missing a few parts. Unfortunately, that means there was a lot of work to do. I still don't have the really nice vise that this came with when they were new, and it's about $350 to buy the vise, which is why I still don't have one. But after about 4 years, and a lot of help from friends who understood both Marvel saws and three-phase power, because these things always come with a three-phase motor on them, this thing is finally operational. It works pretty darn good. It's not perfect because it was kind of a beater when I got it, but the price was right, and with some patience and some TLC, we were able to get it running. There are lots of other vertical bandsaws and horizontal bandsaws out there. Don't feel like you got to go out and find a Marvel, but I considered myself very lucky to get this one, and I'm really glad I have it. The Marvel saw is belt driven. It's got 3-step pulleys here to run the belt, and it has a sliding spline, and as it runs, it has a counterweight system that will run the saw forward. So it's automatic feed. It will also tip 45 degrees either direction as needed, although I've got my phase converter back here so it won't tip that way, but I can tip it this way 45 degrees if I need to make angled cuts. Like I said, this is 3-phase, so I have to start a phase converter to convert my 2-phase power. And then I can start the saw and set it in motion. And then I can go do something else for a few minutes while that works. It's been about 3 or 4 minutes to go most of the way through this 1" by 1.5" bar that will eventually become an axe or an adze. And that's fairly slow. This saw will cut faster. The saws, when they're complete, have a coolant system. They have a reservoir and a pump system to pump coolant, and you can run them a little faster, but since that is one of the things my saw does not have, I just just run it really slow and don't stress the blade. And this blade has been in operation now for about 2 years and it still works just fine. So I don't really miss the coolant or having to deal with the mess that having water or some form of coolant pumping around can make. You have to clean that tank out and it collects bugs and things like that. But this works just fine. This saw also has an automatic shutoff system. If the blade travels to a certain point, it will turn the power off. A chop saw is a very useful piece of equipment. As far as power tools for blacksmith shops go, these are relatively affordable and very easy to come by. Most home centers will sell a decent quality chop saw. I'm sure I got this one someplace like Home Depot. But chop saws are noisy. They throw out a lot of dust. They make a huge mess. So I keep this one. This is kind of out of the main shop area. And of course the blades are consumable items, so you wear through them. So they cost a little bit more to run than some other options because you do go through blades fairly fast. But they are highly functional. And it's a good tool to have around the shop. I've had chop saws around for a lot of years. And note that that is plural because you do wear these saws out faster than you wear out some of the other higher quality tools. That Marvel saw has been running for probably 50 years one way or the other and is repairable. Chop saws, when they wear out, they're pretty much trash, and this is probably my 4th or 5th chop saw. One of my favorite cutting tools is this old Edwards Shear. It's manual, it makes no noise, it will cut fairly heavy bar. It's rated at 5/8 square bar, or I think 1/2 by 5-inch flat stock, supposedly it'll cut. That's a lot of work because it is manual powered and somebody's got to pull on this handle. I know the lighting is terrible out here. The camera's in the sun and I'm in the shadows, but it's about the only way you can see most of this right now. The Edwards Shear is what they refer to as an alligator shear. I've seen them called demolition shears. It's not something you find in most metalworking shops because they are kind of crude and kind of rough. They leave kind of a ragged edge that needs to be dressed up on the material. But as I say, they're very simple. You put a piece of bar in, and it's got a 6-foot handle. You pull the handle, and you cut the bar. That's all there is to it. Maintenance-wise, you put a little oil on this every now and then. The blades in this shear have been in here since I bought it. I swapped the blades out when I got this shear, and that was over 30 years ago. And I have not replaced the blades, I have not sharpened the blades, and I'll bet you I have made hundreds of thousands of cuts using this shear. All mild steel. This won't do hardened steel. Now if you compare that Edwards shear to the chop saw, that shear I paid about what I paid for a chop saw, although they're probably a lot more expensive now, and most of them are used, so you might get a good deal somewhere because people don't really know what they are. But I paid about the same amount. I paid $150 for a new set of blades, and that was 30 years ago. And the shear still works just fine. I've never had to replace it. I probably never will replace it. I suppose someday if I keep doing this till I'm 100 years old, I might have to replace the blades again. No big deal. Those can be taken out and sharpened, and if I need to, I'll do that, but I just haven't needed to. On contrast, I have probably gone through 4 or 5 chop saws, so I've spent a lot more money buying chop saws. The chop saws are loud, they are dusty, they are somewhat risky if you manage to break a blade. That blade flies off out of there. I've never done that. I've had little catches and chips out of blades, but it's never been a big deal. But it is a risk, so it's something you need to be aware of. You should wear respiratory protection and hearing protection and eye protection when you're using the chop saw, and that's not really that necessary for the shear. The shear's quiet, no electricity, doesn't cost you anything to run. If I didn't ever need to cut tubing and hardened materials, I'm not sure if I would own a chop saw. The shear is really money maker in my shop as far as I'm concerned. And sometime we will address production concerns and what that really means and why that shear is so valuable in my eyes. While we're talking about shears, let's take a look at this shear. This is a Beverly B3, and it's capable of cutting 1/8 inch sheet metal. And it's a sheet metal shear. It's not for cutting bar stock, but it will cut curves in sheet metal. So if you're making a shovel form or a shovel pan for a fireplace setter or coal shovel for your forge, this will cut a little bit of a curve on here. It'll need some cleaning up. It's not a super precise thing, but it makes pretty close work. And again, no electricity, no noise, no dust. Pretty darn safe as long as you don't stick your finger in there. And really a pleasure to use. Very handy tool. A final abrasive saw that goes along with the angle grinder and the chop saw is this gas-powered saw. This is really something that is not common in a blacksmith shop. I bought this for construction work when we were building the house, but I find it handy from time to time to either cut things out here in the yard when the fire danger is low. Right now I wouldn't dare do it. Or to take to the steel yard and cut material to load in the truck, and we've taken a look at that in the past. I think I have covered most of the general varieties of cutting tools that I have in my shop. Of course, there are others out there. One thing we didn't talk about was a cutting torch. If you've got an oxyacetylene torch, a cutting torch can be really handy for cutting shapes in heavier material, cutting bar stock roughly to length. It tends to leave a ragged edge. It's going to need to be ground and smooth, but it can be very useful. I don't use it a lot, but there are times when it's about the only thing in my shop that's going to get the job done. And you can either buy a specific cutting torch that's a straight torch for just that one purpose, and I like those because I think this is a better torch. But you can also buy a cutting head for your regular oxyacetylene torch body, and this just goes on where the welding tips or the rosebud tips would go. Very useful, very functional. I just like this one a little bit better. When we think about cutting with a torch or some other way, there are also plasma cutters which use electricity and an air stream to create a plasma stream that will cut material. It's much cleaner than a cutting torch. It's probably safer because there's no explosive gas in your shop, but they're somewhat limited and fairly expensive. You can get plasma cutters that'll cut great big heavy material, but they cost a lot of money. I had one once. Its maximum was 1/8 inch, and that means that it was only really good for about 1/16 of an inch material, and I just didn't use it that much and didn't really like it. I would rather cut sheet metal with a cold chisel than with that particular plasma cutter. I think it's, for the money of the plasma cutter, I can cut a lot of sheet metal with a cold chisel, but I also have the bandsaw and the Beverly Shear, and that fills that in. And I didn't actually talk about cutting sheet metal with a cold chisel, but now we have, so we know we can do that. And if you go watch, I think, the video on making a shovel, the fireplace shovel, I do show how to cut that pan out with a cold chisel at the anvil instead of using some sort of power tool. But plasma cutter will certainly do that. If you have one, you know how to use it, make use of it. It's not something I recommend for every blacksmith shop. Of course, a lot of this stuff I don't recommend for every shop. Remember, I've been collecting tools for a long time, and I've got a lot of stuff that if I were starting over today might not be exactly what I would go out and buy. But as you acquire and collect and find good deals online or at sales, you tend to end up with more stuff than you thought you'd end up with. In addition to the plasma cutter, you can have things cut commercially, and that can be either plasma, laser, or water jet cut. I don't know anybody that has a water jet machine in a small shop like this. I think you can get laser cutters that will fit a small shop. They're generally computer controlled, and you create the pattern in the computer and you run it through the computer to run the machine. It will cut as many parts as you want, exactly the same. that can get a little redundant. It can be a little boring on some projects, but on others, like creating flowers, like the other day we did the poppy, and those poppy blanks would be an ideal thing to have cut by machine, either laser or water jet cut. You get a nice clean blank out of it, and it's a really good way to go. And we'll show you some other things in the shop that are laser cut at some point. I think there's a hinge laying around here that was probably laser cut, and we'll show you how to make these little hinges if you want to buy laser cut blanks, and I'll tell you where the blanks came from. I do very little that way, and water jet cutting I do even less because it's really quite expensive to have things water cut or water jet cut, especially in large material. Cutting 1/8 inch stuff isn't so bad. When you get to 1/4 and 1/2 inch, water jet cutting is rather expensive. But none of that is really necessary in the small blacksmith shop. That's getting on to grander, more involved projects. And if you're just doing one-off pieces, what do you really need in the shop? What are my recommendations for the blacksmith that is just starting? Well, it's really just 2 tools for cutting. A hacksaw for cutting cold, mild steel. A hot chisel for cutting hot material. And you can make the hot chisel. If you buy annealed tool steel, you can cut that to length with the hacksaw. If you're using salvage steel to make your hot chisel, you either need some other way to cut it hot, because this isn't going to cut the hardened salvage material, leaf spring or jackhammer bits, whatever. You're not going to cut it with the hacksaw blade. So you'll need a way to cut this, and that may add a 3rd tool, and that would be the angle grinder. And we did a video on why I think an angle grinder is a handy thing to have in the shop. But if you start with new annealed material that is soft, or if you anneal your other material, it's difficult to get it as soft as it comes new, but you can probably still cut it with a hacksaw blade if you anneal it in the forge. Then you can just make your cold chisel or your hot chisel. And that's really the only 2 tools you have to start. You can do a lot of work with these. And variations on the hot chisel in larger sizes or smaller sizes for cutting out sheet metal, and handled versions that you use with a striker or under a treadle hammer are extremely handy. You will use those throughout your entire blacksmithing career. These are 2 tools you need, whether it's your first day in the blacksmith shop or whether you've been doing it for 50 years. These are tools you're going to use all the time. Chop saws are optional, band saws are optional, cutting torches are optional. They're handy tools. You'll like having them in your shop, but don't run out and buy them just because you saw it on this video. Wait till you need them and get by with these while you can. The more you use these, the better you get with them. So that's my take on what cutting tools you really have to have in your shop. Hacksaw and a chisel, maybe an angle grinder with an abrasive blade in it. But after that, it's all optional, and everything else we looked at are just things that I have in my shop, just so you know kind of what's available. There are lots and lots of different versions of all these. You can find horizontal band saws, vertical band saws. There are cold saws that use a toothed metal blade to cut steel, only mild steel again, but they don't need to have the blades replaced as much. They do need coolant, and they are more expensive than a chop saw, but in a lot of ways they're better to be around because they're not so noisy and they don't throw out the dust. But I don't have one of those, so I don't really know a lot about them. Who knows, maybe someday I'll be tempted and I'll buy one, but I don't really know where I'll put it because my shop is really kind of full right now. Oh, and one last thought, there are hydraulic shears out there. Iron workers, the various manufacturers make hydraulic shears, punches, benders, all in one unit. Very useful in a fabrication or a high production shop. Not something I really want in my shop. I don't have room for it, don't want to spend the money on it, and I don't know that I would use it that much. It isn't a complete replacement for anything else I've got, so it would just be an extra piece of equipment to have in the shop. But if I ever found a small one, I might consider it. Anyways, I hope that was useful. I hope that you can put some of that information to work in your shop. But more importantly, I hope you can get out to your shop, Hope you can make something. Enjoy your time in the shop. But do stay safe, do wear your safety glasses, and we will see you for the next one.